Are you ever going to be able to afford a home? Hi all, I'm a Destitute Zamboni and welcome back to Ground Up History. Today we're going to be talking about perhaps a touchy subject for some, housing affordability. But not in the way you might be thinking where we talk about markets or investments. We're going to be talking about in the context of mud. And when I say mud in the context of housing, you might have an immediate sort of image that pops into your head of that infographic you saw where there's that destitute village in Africa and the guy asks you for $1 a day so his company gets a tax break. And that's the exact kind of stigma I want to try to approach and dissect today. Because for basically all of human time, we've used mud as a building material to provide shelter because it's cheap, abundant, and it works well enough. And when we allow these kind of stigmas to continue to build and fester, we create barriers to shelter. We create these ideas of housing as something more than shelter, something that has to have value, symbolize technology, symbolize power. And when we don't address those, we can end up creating, apparently, huge problems for ourselves. So to start off this discussion of mud housing, I wanted to start with some props because I make tiny houses in my free time, and that is who I am as a person. Welcome to my space. So first off, this is an example of what would be a wattle and daub house. If you don't know what that means, it's essentially a series of cross beams that are thick wood, and in between them would be these interlaced sticks. You would pack mud, straw, and even manure onto that, let it dry in the sun, throw on some whitewashing, add some shingles, get fancy with it. But boom, you have a house. You could do that anywhere. You could be a Saxon peasant landing, you could be a Viking, you could be a Chinese peasant in 4200 BCE, and you could build that house, and you could live there, and it would keep you warm and safe. Maybe you're a little, more modern. You have more actual proper wood logs. Maybe you have a thatched roof. Very medieval of you. Guess what? That's still got mud in it, though. Mud is an amazing insulator. It works so good for temperature regulation. So packing between the straw with mud, sealing between the boards, works great. Maybe you want something a little more painted, a little nicer. Still got mud in it, baby. That right there has also got mud in the ceiling. It's got mud on this whitewash section. It's all about that insulation and reliability. And you might find that your house breaks down over time. No worries. Mud is cheap. It's everywhere. You can fix this bad boy up, no problems. Even if you want a 2-story house, wattle and daub mud, you can do a lot with it as a building material. Maybe you've got a basement and a cellar, probably going to be packed mud or mud brick. The point being with all of this, all of these kind of buildings that we maybe think of as more modern, more advanced, still all utilize mud because it's a reliable material. Okay, but maybe you're not just into the cottagecore aesthetic. Maybe you want a little bit more elaborate construction. Fair enough, more power to you. There's something that we have used everywhere forever other than just wattle and daub or packing mud in between straw. Mud brick. So you can take mud, you can pack it real dense, leave it out in the sun, and it dries hard. In some places, you wouldn't even do that to mortar in between the bricks. In China, they actually had a technique where they would keep the bricks wet and hammer them together so they would dry fused. The beauty part of both being that it was cheap to make, mass producible, but also sturdy. It was strong. It allowed you to build foundations. So even if you had a structure that might be wood, the base of it might still be mud. There are all kinds of buildings all over the planet that utilize mud, that are beautiful and impressive structures, all utilizing different techniques unique to their region. In sub-Saharan Africa, in Mali, you have the Great Mosque of Jem, one of the most impressive buildings in the whole continent for its time. Or in Khiva, Uzbekistan, there are walls around the city which withstood cannonballs made out of mud brick. Or one of the most impressive, Shibam, Yemen, literally called the Manhattan of the desert. In the 16th century, there were 16-story tall towers made out of mud brick. Now, just think about that for a moment. Imagine living in an apartment tower in medieval Yemen, and it's made out of mud. Even other things, more artistic, like if you want carvings, you can go to Chan Chan, Peru, and see beautiful carvings that don't use stone. Or even in a modern example, you can go to Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, and you can see people living in a modern home with electricity, running water, but it's built out of mud. All throughout human history, there have been examples of housing which is lower quality and housing which is higher quality. But the distinguishing factor isn't necessarily what the house is made out of. It's what those people have access to. If you're in ancient Athens, you could have a person living in a mansion with slaves and all the amenities their society could provide, and a person living in a dirt hut next door. Both of those buildings are probably made out of mud, but the distinguishing feature is the socioeconomic inequalities that led to those people's disparity. And the realities of using mud in both of those places probably had more to do with practicalities than status. Okay, but you might be thinking right now, that's all fine and good. Sure, there's lots of examples of housing that might utilize mud, but that's not really the core problem when we talk about things like mud huts in Africa, is it? And sure, you're right, I'll address that. Let's go down to that adobe simple hut in the Sahel. Here's the thing. There are lots of different reasons why people live in those kind of houses. A lot of them do have to do with poverty and inequality, but a lot of them also might have other reasons. For example, if you live in a region with termites, you can't exactly build with wood. Mud is great for that. Or if you live in an area that's very hot, again, mud is an insulator. It's just really effective. If you live in a place where maybe it's not the most secure or stable, or maybe there's really variant weather, it's good to have a house that's easy to rebuild cheaply, if you can't afford to build a fully storm-proof house in particular. And in some cases, there are even examples of cultures where building a house has a ceremonial purpose. Can you imagine that? A house having a cultural significance, sets you in a place, gives you a connection to the land. There are examples of people who live in modern cities along the coast or have ties into their backcountry, and they return to their hometowns to live in a mud hut on the weekends while they farm. It's not necessarily solely indicative of poverty or backwardsness. In fact, when I think about that, that almost seems like a fantasy. The point being, the ability to build a house is fundamentally the issue at hand. And when you look at a lot of these places, it makes a lot more sense to try to upgrade what they have than impose modern ideals. Maybe it makes sense to replace thatch in some cases with corrugated metal so it doesn't burn, but maybe that gets too hot. Maybe thatch does make more sense. It's a better insulator. Maybe it makes sense to have running water in the house itself. Maybe it makes more sense to have a community well. It's about meeting people where they're at. And when we approach housing with stigmas and ideas of what technology and modernity mean, we lose sight of far simpler solutions. Maybe we need to bring some ideas from over there to other parts of the world, because quite frankly, when I look out in certain cities in North America and I see endless suburban sprawl, I don't see prosperity or modernity. I see a hedge fund owned gated community that has no culture or ties or connection to the land. How is that better? And look, here's the main crux of all of this. I live in Canada. This is a country with more land than almost anywhere on earth. And it used to be that when people came here, they would go out to a field and they would literally cut sod out of the soil, stack it, and live in that. And yeah, that's not ideal. But it gave them shelter in the winter. It allowed them to have a place for their home. It allowed them to farm. Or you could open a book and order a house off the Eden catalog in the same way today you might order your groceries. We used to treat housing like something baseline. And sure, it wasn't always flashy. It wasn't always nice, but it was expected. It was normal. And now it feels like housing has become a luxury, something exclusive. If you want to build a home today, it could put you in debt for the rest of your life or just be completely unaffordable. When did that happen and why? Because it seems like when we continually prioritize all these new tech solutions, like, oh, we're going to hyperloop our way out of this one. We're going to have a 3D printed concrete house or container shipping buildings. That doesn't strike me, frankly, as a whole lot better than one of these nice little medieval houses. Why are we trying to innovate for problems we solved 30,000 years ago? Why can't we just go to the simple pool? Why do we have to tear down old buildings to build new towers? Why do we have to constantly reinvent ourselves? And okay, look, maybe you're not there. Maybe you're not willing to live in a mud house, even if it's free. Fine. But I hope that this video can at least show how some of the ways in which we stigmatize are present and how people live also is affected by the ways in which we bias our understanding of the past. And broadening our perspective on us can maybe help us realize that people before us were intelligent. They had solutions. Maybe there are things worth learning from them too. All right, well, thank you for watching the video. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And hopefully next time I'll be a little bit less intense. Unless